Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So imagine for a second that you're sitting down with your friends or maybe your family for a game of Monopoly.
Oh boy. The classic friendship ender.
Right. I mean, we all know how this goes. At the beginning, everyone's laughing, passing the dice, moving their little metal dog or the thimble around the board. But as the game progresses, something shifts in the atmosphere.
It always gets tense.
Always. Because the goal of Monopoly isn't just to make, like, a comfortable living so your little token can retire peacefully on Baltic Avenue. That's not how you win.
Definitely not.
You only win when every single person sitting across the table from you is completely bankrupted, humiliated, and stripped of all their assets, while you sit there owning the entire board. It is this zero-sum game of total domination.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the game.
Exactly. Now imagine that drive, that specific insatiable hunger to not just have enough, but to have more at the direct, literal expense of everyone around you. And apply that to real life. Ancient Greek philosophers and historians actually had a very specific word for that exact drive. And the craziest part,
Yeah.
the New Testament writers looked at that exact same word, and they called it the ultimate form of spiritual treason.
Which is just a massive claim when you really think about it.
Right. And that is the mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring this fascinating intersection of ancient historical texts, philosophical treatises from Athens, and some really deep theological commentaries from the early church. We're tracking this single, incredibly potent ancient Greek word. It's pronounced pleonexia.
Pleonexia.
And I have to tell you, this is way more than just a vocabulary lesson or, a dry history lecture. We are tracking how a concept that began as a term for political power grabs and ruthless military ambition somehow evolved over the centuries into what the Apostle Paul defines as pure idolatry.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. Our goal today is to understand how this ancient definition of wanting more perfectly diagnoses the hidden fractures in human nature. It's an exploration into the reality of our hearts, really revealing the depths of human depravity that lurk right beneath the surface of our everyday lives. So, okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer depth of this historical timeline is staggering. But before we get into the ancient empires, we need a baseline. What is the fundamental structural meaning of this word?
Well, if we break down the etymology, the word group is formed from two Greek roots. First, you have pleon, which simply means more. And second, you have the verb echo, which means to have.
Okay, more and to have.
Right. So literally at its most foundational structural level, the meaning is having more. But, language is a living thing. And as this word developed in the culture, it quickly took on this active, aggressive sense.
It didn't just stay as having more.
No, it moved from the passive state of having more to the action of receiving more. And finally, it settled into the chronic, insatiable condition of wanting more.
Wow. Having more, receiving more, wanting more. I mean, when you lay it out like that, it sounds remarkably like the progression of an addiction.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like.
You build a tolerance to what you have, so you need to receive a higher dose, and eventually your entire existence is defined by the craving for the next hit.
That is a very apt way to look at it, actually. And it perfectly sets the stage for how the earliest secular Greek literature used the term. What's fascinating here is that we tend to translate pleonexia today as simply greed or avarice.
Right.
And when a modern person hears the word greed, they immediately picture, like, a cartoonish banker hoarding gold coins in a vault.
A Scrooge McDuck swimming in money.
Exactly, Scrooge McDuck. But when you look at the earliest historians, like Herodotus and Thucydides, the concept was much broader, much more systemic, and vastly more dangerous. In those ancient texts, it wasn't primarily about money at all. It was about political dominance.
I find that fascinating. The idea that greed isn't just a financial sin, but a political one. Walk us through how Herodotus uses it, because he applies it to the Spartans, right?
He does.
And if there's one thing we all know about the ancient Spartans, it's that they were not exactly known for their booming Wall Street economy or luxury shopping districts. I mean, they were ascetic warriors. They lived in barracks.
Right. The Spartans were famously anti-luxury. I mean, they didn't even use gold or silver currency for a long time. They actually used iron bars specifically to discourage the accumulation of wealth.
Oh, wow. Iron bars.
Yeah, to make money literally heavy and burdensome. Yet, Herodotus uses pleonexia to describe them. Yeah. In Book 7 of his Histories, he uses the term to describe the raw, unvarnished hunger for power that drove the Spartan military machine.
Oh, interesting.
And then in Book 8, he uses the verb form to describe the striving for power of Themistocles, who was the great Athenian politician and general.
Okay, so it's not about cash for them.
Not at all. Herodotus is showing us that pleonexia is the drive to conquer. It plays a massive role in national and international life. It's the animating spirit of imperialism. It's basically one nation looking at another and saying, we must subjugate you to secure our own superiority.
So when Herodotus calls someone a pleonectos, which is the noun form for a person infected with this, right?
Right.
He isn't calling them a penny pincher. He's calling them an empire builder in the worst sense of the word.
Yes, he's calling them presumptuous and aggressively ambitious. And the historian Thucydides takes this definition even further during his chronicling of the Peloponnesian War.
What did he say?
Well, Thucydides links this word to the will to press one's advantage. He argues that this drive derives directly from hubris, which is the sheer arrogance of power.
Hubris, wow.
Yeah. He paints this incredibly dark picture of human nature during wartime. He talks about aristocrats taking the greater share of resources while the city burns. He talks about factions seeking political gain by forging ahead while actively pushing their rivals down. He actually defines a pleonectes as a robber, coupling it directly with the Greek word for violence.
The robber. Man, that completely reframes how we think about our own ambitions.
Yes.
Because the root of this vice, according to these ancient historians, isn't just about possessing shiny objects or having a nice car.
No.
It is an inherent drive for superiority. It's self-assertion over others. It is the hunger to dominate the landscape around you.
And that domination is key. Xenophon, another ancient Greek writer, used the word to mean to outdo someone, or to be superior in number and weapons, or to treat someone arrogantly. It is never passive accumulation. It's the aggressive consumption of the space, the people, and the resources around you.
Which brings us right back to that monopoly board we started with. The drive of pleonexia isn't satisfied with simply having a lot. It demands that you have more than the person next to you at their direct expense. You want the superiority.
You want to win the board.
Right. But obviously, a society can't function for very long if everyone is treating their neighbors like rival empires that need to be conquered.
So if this started as a political disease, a nationalistic imperialism, how did the Greek thinkers start diagnosing it on an individual level?
That is the pivotal question that drove the greatest minds of Athens. I mean, the Greek philosophers realized that the bloody wars destroying their city-states weren't just political phenomena. They were the external manifestations of a rot inside the individual human soul.
Okay.
And this sets off a massive philosophical battle against what some ancient texts refer to as the master race ethics.
The master race ethics. That is a chilling phrase. What exactly were they debating there? We see this debate most clearly in Plato's masterpiece, the Gorgias. In this dialogue, Socrates, who, serves as Plato's mouthpiece, is engaged in a fierce intellectual battle against a group of thinkers known as the Sophists.
The Sophists, they are kind of the debaters of the time, right?
Exactly. They were essentially the moral relativists of their day. They taught rhetoric and the art of persuasion, mostly to wealthy young men who wanted to gain political power in Athens.
So they were teaching people how to win arguments, regardless of the truth.
Right. And one of the characters in the dialogue, a man named Callicles, lays out the sophist argument perfectly. He argues that pleonexia, this aggressive striving for more, this pressing of your advantage, is actually a perfectly natural, healthy instinct.
Yeah, let me guess. It's the ultimate might makes right argument. The idea that nature dictates that the strong eat the weak. Like the lion doesn't apologize for eating the gazelle. So if a human being has the intellectual or physical power to take your land or your money or your political freedom, that's just the natural order asserting itself.
That is exactly Callicles' argument. He claims that the strong have a natural right to take whatever they want. And the only reason society calls pleonexia a bad thing, the only reason we label it as greed or injustice, is because weak people got together and made artificial laws against it out of jealousy and fear.
Unbelievable.
According to the Sophists, taking the advantage was only wrong by human convention. not by nature. They viewed morality basically as a tool invented by the weak to chain down the strong.
It's amazing how little human nature changes. I mean, you could scroll through certain corners of the internet or listen to modern alpha male podcasts today and hear that exact same argument being made verbatim.
Oh, absolutely.
The idea that empathy is weakness, that dominating your competition by any means necessary is just evolutionary biology,
Yeah.
and that you should never, ever apologize for taking what you want. Cowley's would have 1 million followers today.
Without a doubt, he'd be huge on social media. But Plato, through Socrates, vehemently disagreed with this worldview, and his counter-argument wasn't just a polite disagreement about manners. For Plato, pleonexia wasn't just a breach of a man-made social contract. It was a violent disruption of the cosmos.
Okay, when you say cosmos, I think most of us immediately pictures stars, galaxies, outer space. But what did that word mean to a philosopher in ancient Athens?
For the Greeks, the cosmos wasn't just the physical universe. It was the fundamental harmony, order, and beauty of all reality. It encompassed the gods, humanity, nature, and the state.
So it's everything working together.
Exactly. It was the profound idea that everything has its proper ordained place and that the universe operates on a rational, proportional balance. Socrates argues in the Gorgias that heaven and earth, gods and men, are held together by community, moderation, and justice. And because of this intricate, beautiful balance, the whole universe is called an order, a cosmos, and not an untamed, chaotic mess.
And so pleonexia acts like a wrench thrown into that cosmic machinery.
Precisely. Plato contrasts pleonexia with what he calls geometric equality and the virtue of sophrosyne, which translates roughly to moderation, self-control, or soundness of mind.
Okay.
When you give in to pleonexia, when you constantly grasp for more than your ordained share, you are introducing chaos, what they called a cosmian, into the universe. Yeah. You are literally tearing the fabric of reality apart because you refuse to stay within the boundaries of justice. You're acting like a rogue cell in a healthy body, consuming resources without limits, which, when you think about it, is the exact definition of cancer.
That is a staggering way to view our mundane desires for more. It elevates greed from a petty misdemeanor to a cosmic crime. You're not just cheating on your taxes or underpaying your employees. You are fundamentally warring against the harmony of the universe.
And this wasn't just a fringe idea for Plato. He weaves this warning throughout all his major works. In his Republic, he talks about how pleonexia causes truth to be exchanged for mere opinion, driving the urge to violently assert oneself. In the Symposium, he links it to erotic desire and total immoderation. In his work, Laws, he explicitly calls the act of encroaching on what belongs to others a hamartema, which is a word that means a fatal flaw, a failure, or a sin.
And Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, he picks up this baton as well, right?
He does, yeah. Aristotle builds on this framework by categorizing the pleonectus, a covetous man, specifically as atikos, which means unjust.
Unjust.
Right. Aristotle was brilliant at taxonomy, at categorizing human behavior. He drew a sharp distinction between different types of vice. For instance, he argued that someone who commits adultery might be driven purely by physical passion or weakness.
Just loss of control.
Exactly. But the covetous man, the one driven by pleonexia, is acting out of a fundamental injustice. He is consciously, aggressively violating the principle of fairness and equality. He is intentionally taking what rightfully belongs to another person. It's a calculated violation of boundaries.
It's the aggressive, premeditated nature of it that makes it so toxic. I know the Greek orator Chrysostom also weighed in on this, and his take feels incredibly psychological.
Oh, Chrysostom is fascinating here. He actually delivered an entire speech dedicated to this single topic, his Oration 67, and he called pleonexia the greatest evil for a man himself.
The greatest evil, why?
What Dio points out is the profound social isolation that comes with this vice. He notes that while people might envy a rich person or they might fear a powerful tyrant, no one actually pities or honors a truly greedy person.
That's true.
A true pleonectes is universally despised. They're seen as an enemy to all because every single person intuitively knows that this person's gain requires their loss.
That makes perfect sense. Because, again, their entire existence is predicated on outdoing you. You can't be true friends with someone who views you merely as an obstacle or a resource. By constantly wanting more, you end up utterly alone.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of Greek thought, we see a really profound psychological insight. Pleonexia is an insatiable void. It destroys the inner harmony of the individual long before it destroys the surrounding society.
Wow.
There's a brilliant moment in Euripides' play, Phoenicia, that captures this beautifully. The character Jocasta is pleading with her two sons, who are locked in a brutal, fratricidal war over the throne of Thebes.
Just destroying everything for power.
Right. She contrasts the idea of less and more, warning them against the tyranny of ambition, and she asks this incredible, piercing question. She says, "But what is more? It has only the name. For what is adequate is enough for the thoughtful." And then she delivers this devastating final verdict. Money is not for mortals.
Money is not for mortals. That hits so hard.
It does, because it exposes the theological lie beneath the ambition. It suggests that this relentless pursuit of wealth, power, and superiority is actually a subconscious attempt to escape our mortality.
We're trying to build a fortress.
Exactly. It's an attempt to become like gods, untouchable and secure. It is grasping beyond what is ordained for a fragile human being. And because we are mortals, not gods, the weight of this pursuit crushes us from the inside out.
Okay, I have to push back here for a second on behalf of everyone listening. Because listening to all this, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, it sounds incredibly noble and ascetic. But wait, isn't a little ambition a good thing?
That's the million-dollar question.
I mean, we live in a world where progress depends on people wanting to build a better life. We want inventors to strive for the next big breakthrough. We want parents to work hard to secure their family's future. We want businesses to grow and create jobs. Where exactly did the Greeks draw the line between a healthy, natural drive to improve one's life and this world-breaking cosmic disruption of pleonexia?
This raises a very important point, and the ancient thinkers were actually quite nuanced about this tension. The philosophers weren't universally against having possessions, engaging in commerce, or just enjoying a comfortable life.
Okay, good.
The boundary line was drawn at the concept of autarkia, which translates to self-sufficiency, and being content with what is adequate. Pleonexia crosses the line when the desire for more becomes entirely decoupled from need.
Separated from actual need.
Yes. It occurs when you want more irrespective of what you actually require to live a good, virtuous, and generous life.
So it's the difference between eating a good meal because you are hungry and want to enjoy the food versus gluttony, which is eating past the point of sickness just for the sake of consumption.
Exactly. The Roman philosopher Musonius Rufus, who was heavily influenced by this Greek tradition, pointed out that true philosophy teaches a person to stand above pleasure and pleonexia. It's about not being mastered by your desires. When your ambition starts requiring the subjugation or exploitation of others, when you feel compelled to cheat or oppress or aggressively outmaneuver someone else just to get that extra more that you don't even need, you have crossed into pleonexia. You're no longer improving your life. You are actively degrading your soul and destroying the societal order.
That clarification is so helpful. It's the relational aspect that defines the sin. The zero-sum game mentality where your win absolutely requires someone else's destruction. And that provides a perfect bridge for us, because as we move through history, we see this concept undergo a monumental shift. How did the Jewish writers in the Hebrew prophets take this Greek idea of a disrupted cosmos and apply it to their understanding of God's law?
Well, this is where the concept gets incredibly grounded in the grit and reality of human suffering. When the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was translated into Greek, which is a landmark translation known as the Septuagint.
Right, the Septuagint.
The scholars needed a Greek word to capture a very specific, very brutal Hebrew concept. The Hebrew word they were trying to translate was betza.
And what does betza mean in the original Hebrew?
The visceral imagery of the Hebrew root is crucial here. Betza originally meant to cut off or to sever, and it evolved to mean unlawful gain.
To cut off.
Think about the violence implied in that phrase. To cut off. It implies a brutal severance. In the Hebrew mindset, this word wasn't used for honest commerce, like a merchant selling goods at a fair price or a farmer bringing in a bountiful harvest.
No.
It was used specifically when someone's financial gain literally cut someone else off from their livelihood, their ancestral land, or their very life. When the Jewish translators chose pleonexia to represent betza, they were making a profound statement. In the Septuagint, pleonexia is never used where the reference is to the honest gaining of a possession. It always implies dishonesty, exploitation, and often outright violence against the vulnerable.
Wow. So if the Greeks saw this as a philosophical disruption of the cosmos, the Jewish writers saw it as physical, flesh and blood oppression.
Yeah.
Tell me about how the prophets talked about this, because the imagery they use is really intense.
It is deeply intense. Consider the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. In Jeremiah 22.17 and Ezekiel 22.27, they use this exact concept to indict the corrupt kings and rulers of Judah.
Okay, what do they say?
They don't critique these rulers for having poor economic policy. They tie their betza, their pleonexia, directly to violence, to the shedding of innocent blood, and to murder. The powerful elites are described by Ezekiel as wolves tearing at the prey, shedding blood, and destroying lives, all to get dishonest gain.
Wolves tearing at the prey.
For the prophets, God's order isn't just Plato's abstract geometric equation. It is a living, breathing covenant of justice and care for the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the sojourner. When a ruler or a wealthy landowner gives in to pleonexia, they aren't just disrupting the universe, they are actively crushing the very people God explicitly commanded them to protect.
It is the unrestricted longing for possessions that completely ignores the humanity and the rights of others. And this Jewish perspective really comes to a head with a figure named Philo, right? Because he lived around the time of Jesus down in Alexandria, and he was deeply immersed in both Jewish covenantal theology and Greek philosophy. How did he synthesize this?
Philo is an incredibly crucial bridge figure. He writes extensively on pleonexia, and he brings the full weight of both traditions to bear on it. He contrasts this vice heavily with the natural equality of men created by God. In one of his works on the sacrifices of Abel and Cain, Philo actually creates this massive, exhaustive list of adjectives for human vices. He lists over 100 different terms for sin.
100.
Yeah.
That is a guy who really wanted to leave no stone unturned. He just sat down with the Greek thesaurus and went to town.
He really did. He was comprehensive. But what is most telling is the company pleonexia keeps in that massive list. He places the pleonectas alongside the unjust, the unequal, the unshared, and the lawless. And most poignantly, he groups them with the friendless, the houseless, and the cityless.
Friendless, houseless, cityless. That goes right back to what Dio Chrysostom said about the greedy person being despised by everyone.
Exactly.
Philo is agreeing that by constantly wanting more, you end up utterly alone. You sever the ties of community. You cut off the relationships that actually sustain human life and flourishing.
And Philo adds a theological warning that is absolutely chilling, one that really gets to the heart of religious hypocrisy. In his work called Special Laws, Philo issues a stern warning against anyone trying to bring a religious offering or a sacrifice to God using wealth that was gained through pleonexia.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because this touches on such a deep, universal human instinct. Think about how often this happens, even today. Someone makes a fortune through shady means, by exploiting their workers, by running a ruthless monopoly, by deceiving their clients, and then to ease their conscience, they write a massive check to a charity, or they drop a huge tithe in the offering plate at church. It's an attempt to spiritually launder the money.
Yes, it's moral licensing at its most deceptive. But Philo says that if you do that, if you bring an offering of ill-gotten gains to the altar, you are attempting something profoundly wicked. You are trying to make God a participant in your pleonexia. You're trying to make the holy creator of the universe an accomplice to your extortion.
That is terrifying. You aren't just keeping up with the Joneses. According to Philo, pleonexia is taking the Joneses' house by force, leaving them on the street, and then trying to give 10% of the profit to God as a bribe. It's an unbelievably arrogant presumption.
It is the absolute height of hubris. And we see this same righteous anger in other Jewish literature of the period. The text, known as the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, plainly states that pleonexia destroys the relation to one's neighbor and incenses God. Another famous text from that era, Pseudo-Thucydides, provides a litany of warnings against wealth. It contains a phrase that will sound very familiar to modern ears. It calls the love of money the mother of all evil. It urges people to be content with what they have and complains bitterly about how gold and the pursuit of it disrupts all the proper orders of humanity.
So if we synthesize this Old Testament and intertestamental framing, we see a very clear trajectory. The Greeks saw this drive for more as a disruption of rational cosmic order. The Jewish writers saw it as the violent oppression of the neighbor and a direct insult to the covenant God. It was viewed as a social crime of the highest order.
Very much so.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the New Testament writers, because they are about to take everything the Greeks and the Hebrew prophets said, combine it, and drop a theological nuclear bomb on the concept. They are going to shift it from a social crime to a deeply internal spiritual treason.
Right. This brings us to what we might call the Pauline shift. Out of the 19 times this word group appears in the New Testament, 15 of those instances are in the writings of the Apostle Paul. He zeroes in on this vice like a laser, and he fundamentally redefines the battlefield.
And he certainly doesn't pull any punches. I mean, In two different letters, Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, and Ephesians chapter 5, verse 5, Paul explicitly defines pleonexia as idolatry. He
Yes.
doesn't say it's like idolatry or it leads to idolatry. He says it is idolatry.
That equation greed is idolatry is perhaps the most shocking and profound diagnostic statement in the entire New Testament regarding human desires. Because up until this point in history, idolatry meant something very specific. It meant physically bowing down to a marble statue of Zeus or sacrificing an animal at a pagan altar. It was a tangible, external religious ritual.
Right. For the average person in the first century, if you weren't burning incense to a golden calf or a Roman emperor, you weren't an idolater. You were in the clear.
But Paul strips away that comfort. He takes this word, pleonexia, which everyone knew meant the aggressive, insatiable drive for more money, power, and superiority. And he says that internal drive is an act of worship. It is bowing down to a false god in the temple of your own heart.
Okay, we need to camp out here and unpack this carefully, because Paul is saying that this internal desire is a religion all on its own. Let's look at how he frames this in his letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 1, verse 29, Paul lists pleonexia as one of the fundamental, inevitable results of the human race being abandoned by God. It's a core component of what he calls the reprobate mind.
Exactly.
Now, for those listening who might not be steeped in theology, this touches on the core Reformed understanding of our nature. What does Paul mean when he says this desire for more is a symptom of a shattered human mind?
That's a critical connection to make. The theological perspective here doesn't mean that every single person is as actively evil as they could possibly be. It doesn't mean everyone is a murderer. What it means is that every single faculty of our human nature, our mind, our will, our emotions, our desires, is thoroughly corrupted. There is no part of us that is untainted.
It's totally pervasive.
Right. In Romans 1, Paul outlines the terrifying history of human rebellion. He argues that humanity knew the truth of God but actively suppressed it. We exchanged the glory of the immortal creator for images of mortal creatures. And because of that initial rebellion, God handed humanity over to our own corrupted desires. We exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and we decided to worship and serve created things rather than the creator.
And that's exactly what pleonexia is, isn't it? It's looking at created things: money, status, power, a bigger house, a better title, a higher follower count, and serving them. It's dedicating your life, your energy, and your devotion to them, hoping they will give you the security, peace, and identity that only the Creator can give.
Exactly. The theological text we are examining note that pleonexia brings a person under an ungodly demonic spell. It is the service of mammon. You are asking a created object to be your savior.
Wow.
And we see this beautifully and tragically illustrated by Jesus himself. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verse 15, a man comes to Jesus demanding that he arbitrates a financial dispute over an inheritance. Jesus refuses and instead warns the crowd, "Take care and be on your guard against all pleonexia."
And then he tells the famous parable of the foolish rich man.
He does.
Oh, this is such a vivid story. This is the guy whose land produces such a massive, overwhelming harvest that he literally runs out of storage space. And instead of giving the surplus away, he decides to tear down his existing barns to build bigger ones. And he has this incredibly smug conversation with himself. He says, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry."
What happens next?
God speaks directly to him and says, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?"
This story perfectly illustrates why Paul calls greed idolatry. Look at the rich man's psychology. He placed his ultimate trust, his ultimate sense of security and peace, in his material accumulation. He worshipped his surplus. He honestly believed that his pleonexia had bought him immunity from the anxieties of the world, and even from mortality itself.
Just like Jocasta said.
Right. Remember what Euripides said in the Greek play? Money is not for mortals. The rich man forgot he was mortal. He thought his bigger barns made him a god. And Jesus frames this relentless drive for more as a false security that completely blinds you to ultimate spiritual reality.
So what does this all mean for us? If pleonexia is fundamentally idolatry, doesn't that shift the sin entirely from the hands to the heart? Because earlier when we were talking about Thucydides and the Old Testament prophets, we were talking about literal robbers, physical violence, and extortion. But Paul and Jesus are bringing it inside. They're saying you don't have to literally rob someone at sword point to be a pleonectes. You just have to worship the idea of more in your heart. How does this completely change our understanding of our own mundane desires for more?
It changes everything because it removes our plausible deniability. It means you can be a law-abiding, polite, contributing member of society. You can have a clean criminal record, you can smile at your neighbors, and you can still be utterly consumed by idolatry.
Wow.
Your hands might be perfectly clean, but your heart is constantly grasping. It is constantly dissatisfied. It is constantly demanding that the universe and God yield more to you. This internal pleonexia replaces a quiet trust in the providence of a loving God with a consuming, anxious, white-knuckled trust in your own ability to secure your future through accumulation.
It's the ultimate betrayal. We are taking the throne of our hearts, kicking God off of it, and putting our 401ks, our career trajectories, or our social status right there in the center. We are looking at those things and saying, save me, give me worth.
And because it is a lethal issue of the heart, a spiritual sickness that operates almost entirely under the radar of civil law, it was incredibly dangerous to the early Christian communities. It's one thing when the Roman emperor is a pleonectus, you expect that, but it's another thing entirely when the person preaching the sermon on Sunday morning is infected with it.
Which brings up a very painful reality. If this idolatry is invisible, how did the early church protect itself? Because this malignant passion didn't just stay out in the secular Roman world, it inevitably crept into the pews and, devastatingly, into church leadership.
Yes, the New Testament and the writings of the early church are filled with urgent, almost frantic warnings about false teachers whose primary motivation wasn't theology but pleonexia. They viewed the church not as a flock to be shepherded, but as a market to be tapped.
Tell me about what the Apostle Peter said regarding this, because the language he uses in his second letter is really intense.
In 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter issues a scathing indictment of false prophets. In verses 3 and 14, he warns that these false teachers, in their greed, their pleonexia, will exploit the congregation with fabricated words. They will make merchandise of the flock.
Make merchandise.
But the Greek phrasing Peter uses in verse 14 is particularly striking. He says they have a heart trained or exercised in pleonexia. The Greek word he uses for trained is gymnasmenon, which is the exact root where we get the English word gymnasium.
Wait, really? So Peter is literally saying they have a heart that has been doing workouts in greed.
That is exactly the image he is evoking. It means they have practiced it. It is a daily routine for them. Their actions are essentially and totally controlled by this muscle memory of extortion. They didn't just stumble into greed one afternoon. They have disciplined themselves to be incredibly efficient at exploiting people. They are elite athletes of avarice.
That is a terrifying analogy. Think about going to the gym, but instead of building physical muscle, you are doing reps of selfishness. You're on the treadmill of exploitation, lifting weights of extortion, day in and day out, slowly building a calloused, hardened heart that becomes an absolute expert at using other people for your own gain. You learn exactly what emotional buttons to push, exactly what fabricated words to say to get people to open their wallets.
And Peter explicitly says they use fabricated words to do it. They tell the congregation exactly what they want to hear. They prey on their anxieties, their political fears, or their desires for prosperity, all to secure financial support for their own empires. This was such a massive issue in the first century Mediterranean world that the Apostle Paul actually had to repeatedly defend himself against accusation that he was doing this very thing.
Right. We see that in his first letter to the Thessalonians. In chapter 2, verse 5, Paul is defending the integrity of his ministry, and he takes it so seriously that he calls God as his witness. He says, "We never came with words of flattery, nor with a pretext for avarice or a cloak for pleonexia." He is pleading with them, saying, "I didn't use my preaching as a smokescreen to get rich off you."
He repeats this desperate defense in 2 Corinthians as well, insisting he has neither harmed nor taken advantage of anyone. Even when he was taking up a financial collection for the starving Christians in Jerusalem, he went out of his way to ensure transparency. He wanted their giving to be a willing blessing, not something extorted out of them by a leader's covetousness. The early apostles were hyper-aware that religious authority is one of the easiest, most effective tools to weaponize if your heart is trained in pleonexia.
Now, there's another connection the New Testament makes regarding pleonexia that I found really shocking when reviewing these historical commentaries. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verse 22, Jesus lists the evils that defile a person from the inside out. And in Paul's letters, like Ephesians 4.19 and 1 Corinthians 5, pleonexia is frequently paired side by side with a Greek word called akatharsia.
Right. Akatharsia translates to uncleanness. In the New Testament context, it almost always refers specifically to sexual impurity, licentiousness, and bodily debauchery.
So financial greed and sexual sin, they're constantly listed right next to each other.
Right.
I mean, On the surface, embezzlement and adultery seem like two completely different categories of moral failure. One is about money and property, one is about the physical body. Why does the Bible link them so closely?
This is one of the most profound insights into the human condition found in the scriptures. The theological sources explain that both of these sins, despite looking different on the outside, stem from the exact same diseased root. Both are forms of pleonexia in the broadest, most spiritual sense.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How are they the same?
Because both are driven by an aggressive, insatiable drive to consume another person for your own gratification, completely disregarding their dignity, their personhood, and their rights before God as an image bearer.
Oh, wow.
Whether it is a false teacher extorting a flock for money to build a personal empire, or a person using another human being merely for fleeting physical pleasure, the spiritual mechanics are identical. It is the exact same sickness. It is the objectification of the neighbor.
Man, that really connects back to the original Greek concept of pressing your advantage and dominating the space around you.
It does. In sexual impurity, you view the other person not as a sacred creation of God to be loved, honored, and protected, but as an object to be consumed to satisfy your own bodily desires. In financial greed, you view the other person not as a brother or sister, but as a stepping stone, a resource to be tapped, a mark to be exploited. In both cases, the core idolatry is the same. You're looking at another human being and saying, my appetite for more is more important than your humanity.
That is incredibly sobering, because it strips away all the respectable veneer we put on financial ambition. Think about how this applies today. We tell ourselves, well, I'm not doing anything immoral. I'm just being a savvy businessman. I'm just maximizing shareholder value. I'm just hustling.
Right.
But if those profits are maximized by knowingly underpaying vulnerable workers, by deceiving clients, or by viewing human beings purely as data points for algorithmic extraction, spiritually speaking, Paul is saying you are committing the exact same violation as someone giving themselves over to complete debauchery. It's the total consumption of the other.
And this devastating reality is exactly why the early Christian leaders, the generation immediately following the apostles, had to draw incredibly hard lines in the sand. Because this malignant passion, as Philo called it, was so destructive to human relationships and to the unity of the church, it had to be quarantined.
Which begs the question, how exactly did they quarantine it? When you read the post-apostolic fathers, these are the bishops and leaders who picked up the baton after Peter and Paul were martyred, they do not mess around with pleonexia.
Not at all. In the writings of Clement of Rome, Polycarp, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the early teaching manual known as the Didache, pleonetale is consistently placed at the very top of their vice lists. They viewed it as the ultimate threat to the community.
Tell me about Polycarp's context, because he writes a very strong warning about this.
Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, and historical tradition tells us he was a direct disciple of the Apostle John. In his letter to the Philippians, he issues a massive, urgent warning against the love of money. He echoes Paul, insisting that believers must be thoroughly cleansed from this covetousness. Polycarp links it directly to unrighteousness, calumniation, and false witness.
Wow.
And the Didache, which was essentially a first-century church manual for discipline and teaching, connects pleonexia directly to robbery. They understood that you couldn't tolerate this attitude in the community without the entire community becoming infected. It was treated like a highly contagious, deadly pathogen.
We see that quarantine mandate clearly in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5. He explicitly commands the church not even to eat with someone who claims to be a Christian brother, but as a pleonectus. Paul says, I'm not talking about the greedy people of the outside world. You'd have to literally leave the world to avoid them. But inside the church, you must purge the evil person from among you. Do not even sit at a table and share a meal with them.
That's a very strict command.
It is. And why were they so strict about this? To a modern ear, refusing to eat with someone because they are greedy sounds incredibly harsh, almost unchristian. I mean, we're very tolerant of greed today. We put greedy people on the covers of magazines and ask them for life advice.
The strictness seems shocking to us, but you have to understand the nature of the first century church. Their entire existence was based on koinonia, a deep, shared, sacrificial fellowship. They met in small house churches, they shared their resources, they ate the agape feast, the love feast together, where the rich brought food to share with the poor slaves who had nothing. The early church understood that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. If you allow the ethics of the Roman marketplace, the might makes right, the pursuit of endless accumulation, the domination of the weak to take root at the communion table, you destroy the koinonia. You destroy the very equality that Christ established. A greedy person at a shared meal literally means a poor person goes hungry. They had to excommunicate it to survive.
It's fascinating that it wasn't just the Christians who saw how toxic this was to human flourishing. The secular Roman contemporaries of the early church agreed completely on its destructive power. Let's talk about Seneca and Cicero, two of the greatest philosophers of the Roman Empire.
Yes, Seneca wrote extensively on avarice, which is the Latin equivalent of pleonexia. In his epistles, he constructs this philosophical history of humanity. He argues that originally, in the Golden Age, humanity lived in a happy state where goods were shared. There was a natural fellowship and peace. But then, avarice disrupted society. Seneca writes that avarice was the force that introduced locks and bolts into the world.
The invention of locks and bolts. Think about the profound psychological weight of that observation. It's poetry, really. The idea that before the insatiable desire for more took over, you didn't need to lock your door. But the moment someone looked at the communal goods and decided they wanted to claim them as their exclusive private property, paranoia entered the human experience. Locks and bolts were invented to protect the hoard.
And Seneca observes a tragic paradox here. He says that avarice wanted something as its own, and by doing so, it made everything else alien. By seeking much, it lost everything.
I marvel at that observation. By trying to claim everything as our own, we alienate ourselves from the world.
Ugh.
We lock ourselves inside our little fortresses of accumulation, terrified that someone is going to take it from us. We lose our connection to our neighbors, to nature, to community. We lose everything in the desperate pursuit of having it all.
Cicero felt exactly the same way. He called it a spiritual sickness. He grouped it with ambition and loose living as a disease of the soul that completely distorts a person's relationship with reality. So you have the greatest minds of the Roman Empire, right alongside the apostles and the early church fathers, all looking at this one specific human drive and saying, this is the poison. This is what breaks the world.
It really is the ultimate diagnostic tool for the fractured human soul. When we started this deep dive, we talked about how messy human nature is, how hard it is to pinpoint exactly why we hurt each other and why we can't find peace. But this word, pleonexia, shines an incredibly bright, uncomfortable light directly on the root of the issue.
If we recap the journey we've been on today, it's quite breathtaking to see how consistent the diagnosis is across centuries and cultures.
It really is. We started on the battlefields of ancient Greece with Herodotus and Thucydides, where pleonexia was the bloodthirsty hunger for political power and Spartan imperialism. We moved to the debate halls of Athens, where Socrates fought against the master race ethics, warning that grasping for more shatters the geometric harmony of the cosmos.
And from there, we traced it into the Jewish tradition, where the Septuagint translators and the Hebrew prophets identified it as betza, the violent severing of community ties, the brutal oppression of the poor by the powerful. We saw Philo warning against the arrogance of making God an accomplice to our extortion.
And then the climax, the Pauline shift. The Apostle Paul taking this ancient concept of aggressive accumulation and diagnosing it as pure, unadulterated idolatry, a core symptom of a reprobate mind. The ultimate spiritual treason that turns us into worshipers of our own security, leading to a heart trained in the gymnasium of exploitation, severing our fellowship with the church, with our neighbors, and with God himself.
And the relevance of this for you, the listener, cannot be overstated. This deep dive isn't just ancient history. We aren't just examining a linguistic relic in a museum. We all have that inner pleonexia.
We do, every single one of us.
We all have that quiet, persistent voice in our flesh telling us that we are owed more, that we deserve a little superiority, that if we just possessed a little bit more money, more influence, more comfort, more validation, we would finally have peace. But as Euripides warned, money is not for mortals. The void in the human heart cannot be filled by the created world. It was designed for the creator.
It's the diagnosis we all share. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the sources on Reformed thinking, I want to leave you with a final lingering question based on everything we've unpacked today. Think about the world we live in right now. If pleonexia is fundamentally the insatiable desire to have more, the aggressive drive to accumulate beyond our needs, and if our entire modern global economy, our social media algorithms, and our advertising industries are perfectly engineered by thousands of brilliant minds to make you always constantly, relentlessly want more, are we inadvertently structuring our entire daily lives around an ancient form of idolatry? Are we going to the gymnasium of avarice every single time we log onto our phones and scroll through a feed designed to make us envy our neighbor? The next time you feel that sudden, undeniable urge to upgrade your life, to outdo the person next to you, to press your advantage just because you can stop and ask yourself, who is really being served? because you might just be looking at a spiritual X-ray, pointing right at the fracture in your own soul. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time.